Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read out Marilyn Butler about Maria Edgeworth. Her first two books are called Castle, Rack Rent, and Ennui. Maria Edgeworth was born in 1768, the eldest daughter of Richard Lovell Edgeworth, a wealthy Irish landlord who went on to marry three more wives after the death of Maria's mother and had 22 children in all. Interested in education and in the practical applications of science, he had a considerable influence on his daughter, and together they wrote Practical Education in 1798. Maria Edgeworth went on to school in England for some years and returned to Ireland at 14, spending the rest of her life there with her family. Her first publication was Letters to Literary Ladies in 1795. A plea for women's education, she went on to establish a high reputation with her writings over the next 40 years. Castle, Rack Rent, 1800, her first novel, centered on Irish life and pioneered the Anglo-Irish novel and probably the colonial novel too. A second Irish tale, Ennui, 1809, established her reputation as a realistic portrayer of Irish life. Her work was greatly admired by Scott, who acknowledged his debt to her Irish novels in the Postscript of Waverley in 1814. His other works based on Irish life are The Absentee, The Ormond. She also wrote novels depicting contemporary English novels such as Belinda in 1801, Lenora in 1806, Patronage in 1814, and Helen in 1834, and many popular lessons and stories for about children, including The Parent's Assistant and Moral Tales and Popular Tales. Marilyn Butler is a rector. I'm not sure what that is, of Exeter College, Oxford. She was educated in Oxford University and has taught both there and at Cambridge, where she was King Edward VII, professor of English literature from 1986 to 1993. Her books include Maria Edgeworth, a literary biography, Jane Austen and the War of Ideas, Peacock Displayed, Romantics, Rebels, and Reactionaries, and the collected works of Mary Wollstonecraft, which she co-edited with Janet Todd. Castle, Rack Rent, and Ennui, the first of Maria Edgeworth's fourth Irish tales, are two ambitious and deeply original novels. Castle, Rack Rent, the shorter, was the bigger name, and features in literary histories as a comic masterpiece, a landmark in the European novel, and importantly, innovative fiction. Ennui, 1809, much less well known, will come to most readers as a genuine surprise. It is a fictionary allegory on the sweeping scale, which represents an age of political revolution for Ireland as for France, and uncovers the social and economic revolution in train in Northern and Western Europe. When Castle, Rack Rent, and Ennui are paired, are two related studies of the same historical process. They read as perhaps the boldest, most innovative, and most influential contribution to English language fiction by the women writers before Charlotte Bronte and George Eliot. They have the best claim to pioneer the 19th century social novel, which, more self-consciously and more precisely than its 18th century predecessors, citizens and remolds the reader's perception of modern social life. Castle, Rack Rent came out in January 1800, a very little critical notice, largely no doubt because it was anonymous and unconventionally short, but in April of the same year, the Edgeworths were told that George III was amused by it. In 1805, that it was a favorite of Pitt, the prime minister. The third edition of 1801 carried Maria Edgeworth's name to the title page. Henceforth, none of her fiction or book-length nonfiction appeared anonymously, however unfeminine the topic. There were three more London editions before the first collected edition of 1825, as well as pirated editions in Dublin and America. A complete German translation appeared in 1802, following extracts in French from the glossary and influential Genevian journal. After the more Irish works by Maria Edgeworth were eagerly awaited, NUI, The Absentee, and The Edmund all attracted more extensive and more favorable reviews than Castle Rackrent that have been able to command. NUI was in its fourth edition by 1813, and it arrived at classic status, and incidental comments about it by well-placed literary intelligence shows Germaine de Stael, the leading European woman of letters, a Genevan intellectual and collaborator with Jeremy Bentham, told Edgeworth in 1813 Byron read and approved of it. Francis Jeffrey, generally avoiding noticing novels in his prestigious Edinburgh Review, he not only carried articles on each Edgeworth book, but they came out in the first decade of the century. He himself praised NUI as perfect and up to the best tales of Voltaire. Sidney Smith suspected that her dissolute clergyman, Buckhurst Falconer in Patronage, was a caricature of himself, and he angrily complained in terms that show how high the reputation of NUI then stood. Everything else I have read of hers I thought very indifferent, even her tale NUI. But the three later Irish tales have not weathered well, and the partial exception of The Absentee, which had benefited from the usual choice of making up a volume of Castle Rackrent, the Everyman edition of these two tales, which first appeared in the introduction of Brander Matthews in 1910, reemerged at intervals later in the century. The two most scholarly and well-annotated editions of the Edgeworth novel are George Watson's Castle Rackrent, issued in, and J.W. McCormick's and Kim Walker's. There has been at least one modern edition of Ormond in the NUI that seemed to have fallen into more total neglect. Apart from late 19th century collected editions of Edgeworth's fiction, it was last published together with Castle Wren and Irish Bulls, two short tales by Rutledge in 1884. With Castle Rackrent, tales and sketches of a life of particular locality became an important 19th century form. Edgeworth and Irish contemporaries and successors in Sidney Owenson, later better known by her married name of Lady Morgan, the Bannon brothers, Charles Lever, Samuel Lover, and William Carlston, Scott's successor in Scott, John Galt, James Hogg, and J.G. Lockhart, and continental successor from Balzac and George Sand in France to Turgenev, Gogol, and Chekhov in Russia. The scale of these fictions of small provincial living has varied so much that we now have difficulty in thinking of a single tradition. Too much of the best modern fiction is always provincial fiction, located anywhere from Bengal to Montana. Early 19th century opinion responded to the novels of national identity and nation building of the size and range of Scots. 20th century taste has preferred something more anecdotal, such as the delicately occasional short stories of Chekhov. 19th century critics proved more willing over time to accept women writers as miniaturists than as national novelists. At first, Scott, writing a postscript in Waverley in 1814, warmly acknowledged Edgeworth's Irish tales as the model of his own portrayal of Scotland in the new historical stage. She may be truly said to have done more towards completing the union of Ireland with Britain in 1800 than perhaps all of the legislative enactments by which have been followed up. But near the end of his life, he distanced himself from his woman's contemporaries. Austen and Edgeworth were suggesting that he works on a bigger scale. I can do the big bow wow strain better than anyone's going, he says, which sounds amiably self-mocking until it is related to his last compliments to his women rivals for their beautifully done small work. He spoke with praise of Miss Austen. There is a finishing off of some of the scenes that is really quite above everybody else. And there's that Irish lady too. Miss Edgeworth. She's very clever and the best in those little touches too. I'm sure that children's story, Simple Susan, where the little girl parts with her lamb and the little boy brings it back again, there is nothing for it but just to put down the book and cry. Out of Edgeworth's substantial aware of three Decker novels, tales, and prolific educational writings, he picks one of the children's stories of what is most memorable because, as it happens, he is no longer remembering much. The irony of that Scott's big topic, social change, national identity, English hegemony features first in Edgeworth's Castle Rackrent and NUI. Indeed, for modern readers, Edgeworth's handling of these themes often has the advantage because it is fresh, odd, complex, and skeptical. Ireland was more of a colony than Scotland, and Edgeworth wrestles with the practical, political, and ethical consequences of her country's colonial status. The contribution her 19th century readers acknowledge is the literature of class. For post-colonial readers, take on new shape on a contribution to the literature of class, race, and gender, a remarkably intuitive, perceptive, and far-reaching portrait of an unequal society. Edgeworth herself writes so self-effacingly in Castle Rackrent that she gives the impression of it merely mimicry. She even implies that John Langham, the Irish steward for his father's estate, took the lead and dictated the tale. The only character drawn from the life of Castle Rackrent is Thady himself, the teller of the story. I heard him when I came to Ireland, and his dialect struck me, and his character and I became so acquainted with it that I could speak it out without effort, so that when, for mere amusement, without any idea of publishing, I began to write a family history of Thady, would tell it, and he seemed to stand beside me and dictate as I wrote as fast as my pen would go. The characters all imaginary. This account, written in 1834, must be taken at face value, even if its modesty is run like a contagion through the critical literature of Castle Rackrent. The reliable aspects of the letter presumably include its declaration that the tale had a very prominence and originated in speech rather than in writing. The first point matters because the date of publication of Castle Rackrent in 1800 has resounding implications in Irish history as the year of Ireland's constitutional union with England. Through Edgeworth had lived in Ireland for 2 years as a child, she must mean by when first I came, her return from an English school in 1782 at the age of 14 to live permanently in her father's estate in country Langford. About a decade appears to have passed before she began to write a family history, as Thady would tell it. In 1819, a relative by marriage reported that Castle Rackrent was written 8 years before publication. Rather stronger family sources merely say the tale began as an attempt to amuse her favorite aunt and confidant, her father's sister, Mrs. Margaret Ruxton, who lived within reach of Edgeworthstown in County Meath. In fact, Miss Edgeworth was living in Bristol with her family in 1792, and for most of 1793. After her return home, she spent part of the winter in 1793 and 1794, reviewing her friendship with Miss Ruxton, who was convalescing from an illness, and the correspondence between the two households confirms that Edgeworth was telling Langham stories at this time. If the book was partly written well before publication, the winter would seem the earliest likely date, for at the latest time of writing, Castle Rackrent must have been sent to the family's London publisher, the celebrated Joseph Johnson, leading literary publisher of the 1790s, quite early in the autumn of 1799. Since it was on sale by early January 1800, it was only while the text was being printed that the Edgeworths decided that an explanatory glossary was necessary. The printer added it after the preface, since the preliminaries were as unusual as the last part of the book to go to press. But through the writing of the glossary can be pinpointed in the autumn of 1799, there is almost no contemporary evidence about when Edgeworth reported on the narrative. Thady's supposed contribution, his letter to Miss Stark in 1834, said that the annals of the last of the Rackrents, Sir Condy, which are longer than those of Sir Patrick, Sir Murtagh, and Sir Kit, put together, were added 2 years after the rest. In October 1798, Edgeworth wrote to D.A. Beaufort, an Irish statistician and geographer, and the father of her new stepmother, Frances Beaufort Edgeworth, to inquire as he had anything to add, alter, or correct to the Rackrent families. Beaufort must have had a manuscript to read. To be in the publishable length, it would have to include the sequel. Taking all the clues together, it seems likely that the annals of the first three Rackrents belong substantially or completely to a time when there was relatively tranquil locally, 1794 to 1795. The Condi part and the complete written version were composed in the years 1796 through 8, when Ireland's epidemic local unrest became politicized and far more threatening to an England at war with revolutionary France. Their neighborhood was drawn eventually into a state of armed rebellion in which the Edgeworth found themselves undesignedly caught up. Few novelists of either sex were as well qualified to make the running with social realism of Edgeworth, put by her intellectual father through a training that what we would call economics and sociology, the new sciences of man of the French and the Scottish Enlightenment. In his youth, R.L. Edgeworth had been to France. Edgeworth's main purpose for her English reader is to frame scenes of Irish peasant life, the vulgarest stratum of British society, within this supremely elegant format. Her subversion is to bring Irish humor and French wit into conjunction. However humble and natural sometimes is its origin, when Castle Rackrent evolves as a sophisticated experiment directing at an existing slot in world literature. Like Marmontel's stories, it comes supplied with a preface which defends on its modern terminology, theorizes the domesticity of the materials. The public taste for anecdote is philosophical. The fine fancy of the professed historian may be either artificial or mendacious. It is from careless conversations and half-finished sentences that we can get at real characters. It is for the truth-telling capabilities that we prefer an informant like the illiterate Thady, who pours forth anecdotes and retells conversations with all the minute prolixity of a gossip in a country town. The notion that this fictional character tells true history or anything resembling a plain, unvarnished tale is, of course, itself mendacious. In the preface, Edwards, or the judge by the style her father, of appropriating a vein of populist sentiment fashionable in revolutionary times and unusable not only by radicals but by the conservatives, to imply that ordinary folk have a homely wisdom not found in their liberal utopian betters. In practice, Castle Rackrent does not rely on Thady's wisdom, but on our ability to see through his folly. The true theme, the ruin of the estate, is apparent to us and the philosophical interpreters whom the preface addresses, but not so the characters, their memorialists, Thady included, wholly displaced in his intellectual concerns from the naive worldview of the small town gossip. The story becomes a microcosmic version of Gibbon's Decline and Fall, an invertive and bizarre study of the localized system of terminal decay. Like Swift and Voltaire before her, Edgeworth was an ironic philosophic tale, succeeds from the outset in making a fool of unwary commentators. Almost all early critics and some recent ones agree in finding Thady plain, simple, and above all loyal. Recently, however, the consensus has begun to swing the other way. More and more, the critics are complaining that the heart of the matter lies in his character, and more particularly in his motivation, which is no longer found transparent. Is he loyal at all to the masters he professes to serve? Could he be thieving rogue, the accomplice of his son Jason, and ends up in possession of his master's estate? Whom does he represent? For modern readers are quicker to see that Thady represents people other than himself. To Tom Doone, who stands for the disaffected rural Catholic masses of the 1790s, the peasant jacquier, which in real life accompanied an invading French army virtually into the gates of the town of Longford in 1798, to P.F. Sheeran, poor Thady or old Thady, honest Thady, is most memorable as a man without a proper name or stable identity, and unpersoning that appears from his people's defeat. He is a superb portrayal of colonized man. Doone cordially picks up his reading and uses it to make Thady seem unusually malignant, a direct threat to his colonial master's security. Thady is a Caliban in the guise of a quaint stage Irish Ariel, his devious and false civility a direct product of the colonial system and destined through the crucial aid of his son to be its nemesis. In unusual meticulous documeter, Edgeworth puts certain constraints on our freedom to interpret her work. Castle Rackrent narrates the annals of a landlord family which is not only a native Irish descent and presumably Protestant in its very recent generation, but which constitutes to mix with other families of the same stock. It never avowedly locks on to the contemporary public event. Instead, its facts and manners are declared on the title page, derived from the period before 1782. The Ireland draws here by Edgeworth is visibly the product of the long history of an English colony, but by placing her fiction in history, Edgeworth asks us not to limit it to a commentary on Ireland in 1800. The book is complex, even kaleidoscopic, and however seductive the appearances we have to test further is typing as a colonial novel. Their astonishing introduction of Thaddeus' voice, the opening papers of Castle Rackrent subvert the common expectations of their day. The Shandean irrelevance of the opening words, Monday morning, sends the first signal that classical order and conventional formal convention have been suspended. In the act of mimicry, the voice of Thady works on a number of levels, and idiolect influenced not only by linguistic factors such as the rhythms of Gaelic, but in cringing and flattery, as Edgeworth calls it in Ormond, or its equivocating, exculpatory, and supplicatory language of its lifelong inferior. Symbolically, it is important that Thady does not play the part of a peasant or a tenant, as most of Edgeworth's sympathetic Lower Irish characters do, but that of a family servant, of universally recognized figure for social inferiority. The strongest historical objection to interpreting Thady as archetypical colonial man is the fact that his literal role, that of serving man, is more generally familiar with his stronger ideological connotations in the 18th century. Thady himself was an understanding of his own meritor. Loyal servants get away with putting their fingers into the till, providing the excise reasonable restraint. Cuteness and acuteness is a trait Thaddeus acknowledges, in fact, is proud of in himself. During young Sir Kit's absence abroad, he connives with his son Jason and with the agent in buying up bits of the estate below the market price. I spoke a good word for my son and gave out into the country that nobody need bid against us. Sometimes he admires a rack rent for being cute in his own interest, like Condy when he orders a clod of earth to be transplanted in his neighbor's estate so that a rack rent tenant can swear the land he stands on is Condy's. While in theory, Thady is native, and he says, and he doesn't say, may plainly be determined by partisanship or cunning. When Sir Condy signs away a jointure of £5,000 to his wife Isabella to be paid for the encumbered estate before any debts, Thady neither comments nor tells Jason about it. Clearly, to the surprise of Condy and as well to Jason, it takes a determined sentimentalist to find Thady consistently lovable. He lacks feeling for anyone except a born Rackrent and a born McQuirk, and even towards the small group he is attached to, his services are patchy. Whatever we think of his coolness towards Jason, his willingness on two different occasions to act as Condy's Pandar and his own great niece, Judy McQuirk, is not wholly amiable. He is consistently out of sympathy with the Rackrent's wives and a de facto accomplice of Sir Kit's 7-year incarceration of his young Jewish bride because she will not give up her jewels to him. In summing up, Sir Kirk's career is remarkable for its economy with the truth. He was never cured of his gaming tricks, but that was only fault he had, God bless him. Even Thady's love for the last Rackrent is first contaminated with self-interest. Like his fellow servants, the huntsman, he sucks up the boy, Condy, because he is the heir. Ian Topless, the general, is shrewd and observant readers of the Irish tales, finds Thady's tears moving in the scene where Condy is driven by Jason to sign the estate away. Jason said, which I was glad of, that I was not fit witness, being so old and doting, reading primarily for these tears. The consequence would seem sentimental. It manages to avoid being a largely thorough or prior knowledge that Thady has an accomplished role in Condy's disaster. It was also he who taught his white-headed boy to gamble and to consider the drunkard Sir Patrick Rackrent the model of the popular Irish gentleman. Condi will die in the act of imitating Sir Patrick's feat of tossing off a full horn of claret, an echo of the scene with which Thaddeus' memoirs opens when Patrick kills himself by the same method. While boasting of Sir Patrick's feats in their drinking line, Thaddeus seems to on the point of acknowledging their futility. He is also said to be the inventor of raspberry whiskey, which is very likely, as nobody has ever appeared to dispute it with him, and is there will exist a broken punch bowl at Castle Rackrent in the garret with an inspiration to that effect, a great curiosity. That quick slur on Sir Patrick's achievement is for the knowing reader only. Thady cannot detach himself from the Rackrents for reason that became clear only with Condi's ruin at the last Rackrent funeral has an intensity foreign to all the previous ones. It is because it ends Thaddeus' feudal employment and so severs his relationship with the land. Without Condi, he ceases to be the equivocal figure, the landlord servant, which is actually part of the system, and begins to utter complaints that comes to a great deal nearer to speaking for the landless mass of the population. Marianne Elliott, in her valuable study of 1798 rebellion, argues that the big politics still had only a small part to play in the mid-1790s in the lawlessness epidemic in so much of rural Ireland. Gangs of local terrorists, such as the White Boys of the Irish Midland counties, and committed murders, killed or maimed cattle, and burned houses and crops, not directly on behalf of their religion, but still in their nationhood, but in the resentment of landlords installed by English law as sole possessors of the land. Under the earlier Brehon law, the clan occupied the land, and those who were now tenants, cotters, laborers, and beggars naturally interpreted this remembrance in their own favor. A mythology of land and loss of Ireland provides the topics of popular Irish culture, especially Gaelic song, ballad, folk history, and memory of the 18th century. Thaddeus' language has been much more variety than more depictions of it suggest. Edgeworth does not convey regional speech throughout the Victorian convention of misspelling, a device which signals the speaker's ignorance and linguistic incompetence. Instead, she adjusts her rhythm and syntax so that it seems possible for the reader to hear an Irish inflection. This general technique allows for considerable shifts in vocabulary as Thady moves from the annals of one master to the next. The brilliantly condensed narrative of the regime of Sir Murtagh and his lady is given to a language thickened by Anglo-French legal terminology, the linguistically archaic remnant of the decayed feudal system. As Condi nears his sodden end, Thady, a parodic bard, provides the native Irish Kenoan, or funeral song in praise of the dead chief, at once a gesture of traditional loyalty and a last act of courtly flattery. Thady's speech and also his character change as his world changes. Through his fictional lifespan, binds the four Rackrents together over about half a century. Their manners suggest a considerably longer history, and Thady's language hints at a longer one still. Sir Patrick's lifestyle looks back to a tribal world. Sir Murtagh's Anglo-French legal language reminds us that both Irish and English shared the experience of colonization by the Normans. By incorporating so much historical freight into the local version of English, Edgeworth gives Irish peasants a past roughly coexistent with Burke's version of English past in his reflection of the Revolution in France, a span of roughly 6 centuries back to the conquest. Absorbing Sir Murtagh's archaic terminology, that reminds us that English carries the evidence of not one but two Norman conquests, a century apart, successful French invasions of the English as well as the Irish. The archaeological layering of Thady's idiom provides a cultural history of his people and hybrid stock of late 18th century Ireland, wherever the topic of the language also says that native and settlers, colonies have experienced centuries of coexistence. For Edgeworth, unlike birth, history is not usable model. Thaddeus' nostalgia is what misleads him and us as into the heart of his unreliability. He is one of the classic instances of that device so brilliantly handled in the 18th century narrative. the unrealistic first-person narrator, a line with again the Swift of Gulliver's Travels, and a modest proposal at its head, much nearer to Edgeworth in time. Godwin in Caleb Williams, 1794, also provides a narrator who is a servant and on what account an unreliable, morally corrupted exponent of his master's character and actions. The themes of Caleb Williams and of Castle Rackrent are closely bound up with one another, since each is an hostile study of the class system and of its impact on the morals and attitudes of both the master and the servant class. But resemblances between Edgeworth's work and Godwin's may stem from their shared part in the discourse of class, which was fast becoming the master discourse in presentation of the public sphere. Edgeworth's debts to Swift are more formal. His narrative writings give her a variety of models, not commented to the continuous plot and to naturalism, allegory, or parable, as we shall see, and also the old comic tradition in the satirical critique or anatomy of contemporary intellectual obsessions. Edwards could be seen as Swift's end-of-century counterpart, where he, as a Tory, satirizes modern intellectual innovations, secularization, scientism, and self-sufficiency. She, as a Whig, satirizes nostalgia, sectarism, parochialism, and blind loyalty. While not binding on the reader, the author's intentions and responses to her text are often deeply suggestive. Edgeworth did not leave a clue that showed she had in mind the Swiftian mode of political allegory, even if the project was never completely implemented. As I have lived, so I will die, true and loyal to the family, as Sadie's governing maxim, and in Edgeworth's mind, it appears to be associated with an Irish political figure. She indicates her interest in these sentiments in the list of penciled manuscripts, core agenda, most never executed, which appear in her handwriting in the first flyleaf of an Edgeworth family copy of the first edition of Castle Rackrent. The first entry reads, page 5th, true and loyal to the family, write a note on loyal high constable. The real life loyal high constable is James Butler, the Duke of Ormond, 1666 to 1745, who in 1668 left the services of James II for that of William and Mary, served these monarchs, and after them Queen Anne, but was attainted in 1715 by the new Whig ministry of George I. He fled to France, made contact with the Jacobite court in exile, and commanded a Spanish fleet, taking supplies to the British Jacobite insurgents of 1718. A hero to some of the traitors, to others, Ormond retained a focus of Irish Jacobite sentiment throughout his earlier 18th century. How should we read the fact that Thaddeus proudly proclaimed loyalty to the odd family fallen on evil times, reminded Edgeworth of Ormond's loyalty to the Stuarts, additionally and alternatively of the loyalty of at least one of Edgeworth's ancestors to the exiled Ormonds? Even if the Duke's services to four successive Stuarts do offer tantalizing parallels to Thaddeus' services to the Rackrents, Castle's Rackrent, it is published form hardly reads like a fully sustained political allegory. This is too particularized a provincial estate easily and stand for its politics of the nation. So in many ways, a Scottish version of Rackrent resembles it in shadowing the 60-year reign of George III while subvernally retaining its sense of locality. Yet it is significant that some of the best recent commentators have seen Anglo-Irish fiction in general as characterized by a tendency towards allegory. NUI confirms that in Edgeworth Irish Tales, allegory is indeed an important technique for introducing wider issues of Irishness. It reappears in most characters who represent traditional Celtic and Catholic Ireland, such as Thady, Eleanor the nurse in NUI, Grace Nugent, and Count O'Halloran in The Absentee, Corny, and Ormond. Thady cannot be read adequately until he is read on two levels, second of which elevates him socially to the level of the very different Irish servant, still indefinable in the truly true and loyal to the family, even without our knowing what many forms of intellectual conservatism, including Jacobism, merged to make the portrait of his loyalty. Thady would prompt comparison with the narrator heroes of the modern allegorist Kusuo Igishiguro in two remarkable studies of precarious 20th century empires, the Japanese and the British. Igishiguro appoints a loyal servant to each system to narrate the process of its downfall. Like Ishiguro's Mr. Stevens, the English butler who tells the story of an English country house and a neo-fascist owner in the remains of the day, Thady lacks a general social ethic. He believes that his responsibilities end in the boundaries of the estate, and within the boundaries he does, and his master tells him. The reader becomes all the more aware of the world, which is not the estate, but of the politics, and Butler shuts out of the entire ethical dimension which the system he serves works to deny. Provoked into compensation for the narrator's complacency, we call up the tottering empire for ourselves. That is the appropriate reader's response to Castle Rackrent. Edgeworth may be her most persuasive as an unabashed critic of the dying feudal Ireland, rather than as a writer that the Union made her, the utopian prophet of the new 19th century commercial empire. We're going to leave this for another day. The study of Mrs. Butler's study of Mrs. Edgeworth and Rackrent and all the characters in it. If there's any truth or enjoyment to what I'm doing here, please like and have a nice day.